Why is the price important?
Price is very important. It's one of the components of the marketing mix that an enterprise can define after segmentation and positioning. And the price, first of all, can be defined as the sum of money that the consumer can exchange for having the benefits, for having the products, or for using these specific products. So there is an exchange between the enterprise and the consumer. The enterprise gives the products represented also value, represent also utility, and the consumer are available to spend a price, to pay a sum of money for having or using these products. But we have to define why the price is important. There are several reasons. The first and the most important thing that we have to underline is that the price is the only component of the marketing mix which generates revenue for an enterprise. If we consider all marketing activities, generally we speak about activities which generate costs. For example, the setting of the product, for example, the communication activity, for example, the distribution of the product. The price is the only one which generates benefits, which generates revenue for the enterprise. And this is the first reason. The second reason is that the price can change immediately. While it's very difficult to change the attributes of the product, one enterprise can decide to change the price during the day. And so is very, very flexible. Third reason, and why the price is important, is the capability of the price to express the value of the products. And in terms of the consumer, the possibility to compare immediately the value and the offer of several competitors. For this reason, is very, very important by the consumer point of view to understand and to know the price in order to decide if buy or not the product. For this power, an enterprise has to give a lot of attention in defining pricing, because it can modify the behavior and the perception of the consumer. So if we speak about price, we can close this topic explaining briefly what are the criteria, methods, approach to define the price. Generally, in the marketing literature, we have three different approaches. The basic, the simplest approach is the one based on cost. There are a lot of techniques. One of these, for example, is to add a markup to the full cost. And so, in this case, we have a cost-based approach. The second approach could be, for example, the demand approach, when the enterprise considers the value that want to give to the consumer. In this case, it's necessary to define what is this value. And so it's defined to understand the value for the customer. And second, if we use this approach, the demand perspective, we have the necessity to consider the price not the final variable, but a variable like the product, like, for example, the communication and so on, that an enterprise has to set immediately or together all other variables of the marketing mix. And finally, there is a third approach. This approach is competition-oriented, because consider the behavior of the competitors. An enterprise can define, for example, a price at the same level of the ones of the product of the competitors, or a lower level, but there is the risk, for example, to start a price war with that enterprise, or in the last case can decide to define an higher price. But in this case, the higher price must be accompanied by a higher quality of the product.
How can an enterprise communicate the value of its offer?
There are several ways. First of all, we have to say that communication is another element of the marketing mix, and generally is the message that an enterprise convey to the market. But it's not a simple activity, because it's a lot of activities. It's a process, because the communication is important in the pre-selling phase, during the selling, during the consumption, and also after the consumption, to establish a relationship with customers. At this end, the enterprise can use several tools. One of the most famous, most diffused, is the advertising. The advertising could be defined any form of no personal communication or presentation of ideas, of goods, of services by an identified subject. In our case, this subject is an enterprise. So we have three different characteristics of the advertising. First of all, the enterprise has to pay to convey this message to the market. Second, it's not personal because the enterprise generally use a media. The example of broadcasting media such as television or radio. And third, the customers knows who is the subject that envoys this message. In other terms, the enterprise. The second tool that can use an enterprise to give this message and so to elaborate its communication strategy, and which composed the strategy is the sale promotion. The sale promotion is the short-term incentives to encourage the purchase or sale of a product. If a consumer stay in a shop, for example, can see often the reducing of prices. This is a form of sales promotion. The reducing of price to encourage the buying of the product. The third tool is represented by public relation. Public relation is the building of a good relation with the various public of the enterprise in order to develop, for example, a corporate image, in order to have a good relationship, in order also to handling problem with this public. For example, story, events, and so on. And the last instrument, the last tool, is represented by personal selling, which is an oral presentation to the customer in order to buy to prospective customers, in order to sell the product, or in order to build a customer relationship.
And how can an enterprise distribute its product?
It's another important function relating to the marketing mix of the enterprise. Generally, we have to speak before and we have to define the distribution channel. The distribution channel is a set of specific organizations which are involved in the process of making the product available to the consumer. And the consumer in this case could be a person for a final consumer or another enterprise. And this is the distribution channel. The distribution channel has a lot of function. First of all, to transfer, to move the goods from the producer or the manufacturer enterprise to the final consumer, and so in order to permit the buying and the consuming of the goods. In any case, these functions are a lot. For example, the transfer of the product in the space, the transfer of the product, for example, in the time. For example, information. For example, is the definition of the money and the way of payment, and so on. There are a lot of functions within these activities. So it's necessary that some subjects, the manufacturer, a specialized organization, or also the consumer, organize themselves to carry on these activities. In other words, it's possible to sustain that the distribution activity always exists. It's necessary to define who is the subject who are involved in this activity. Then, on the basis of this consideration, we can have two different kinds of channel. We can have a direct marketing channel, in the case in which the producer, the manufacturing enterprise, sells the product directly to the final consumer. Or, in the other case, we can have an indirect marketing channel, when the manufacturing enterprise sells to a specialized organization, and these last sell the product or to another organization or to the consumer. In the first case, we have a long indirect channel, because we have the producer, we have generally the wholesaler, the retailer, and the final consumer. While in the second case, we have an indirect but short channel, because we have the manufacturer, the retailer, and the consumer. The last aspect we have to define or underline related to the distribution channel is the relation within the actors and organization in this channel. And in particular, we can have two kinds of strategy. Generally, we define this strategy, communication strategy among actors, among organizations. The first is the push strategy, when generally the manufacturer, so the producer, use sales force to promote the product to the first buyer. That could be, for example, a retailer, or it could be, in this case, in other case, it could be the wholesaler. The wholesaler then promote the product to the retailer, and the retailer promote the product to the final consumer. This is the first strategy. The second and the last communication activity within the distribution channel is the pull strategy. And this happens when the manufacturing enterprise, the producer, spend a lot of money in advertising activities in order to develop the final consumer demand. In this way, the consumer go to the retailer go and ask to the wholesaler to the producer, and the producer finally increase the amount of its selling.